The wind, a mournful whisper through the skeletal branches of the plum trees, carried the scent of damp earth and distant wood smoke. It was the autumn of 1944, and in the small, forgotten valley nestled deep within the Serbian heartland, the world was a chessboard of shadows and fleeting light. Here, in Pranjani, life moved to the ancient rhythms of the land, punctuated now by the ominous rumble of distant war. Young Danilo, barely a man at 17, felt the weight of those rhythms in his bones. His father, a man whose hands bore the rough testament of a lifetime spent coaxing sustenance from stubborn soil, had taught him patience. His mother, her face etched with the quiet dignity of hardship, had taught him resilience. But neither had prepared him for the strangeness that had fallen from the sky, wrapped in ripped silk and speaking a language as alien as the moon. It had happened swiftly, a searing streak across the blue dome of heaven, followed by a sound that tore the air, not unlike the rending of a giant cloth. Then silence, thick and suffocating, broken only by the whimpering cries of Misha, the neighbor's dog. Danilo had been in the fields, pulling at the last stubborn potatoes, when the American bird, a magnificent silver beast, had exploded in a plume of black smoke. He'd seen the small, flailing figures against the sky, like broken dolls tumbling from a child's grip. Fear, hot and immediate, had coiled in his gut. The Germans were everywhere, their presence a suffocating cloak over their lives. They had learned, through brutal lessons, the cost of defiance, the price of compassion. Yet, as he watched the parachutes blossom, slow white flowers descending into the unforgiving embrace of the mountains, something deeper than fear stirred within him. It was a call to something ancient, a silent vow made by generations of his ancestors. When a man falls, you help him up. He raced home, his breath ragged, the image of the falling men seared behind his eyelids. His father, Milos, a man of few words but profound wisdom, listened with a grim set to his jaw. His mother, Anka, wrung her hands, her eyes wide with apprehension. But neither hesitated. They were Serbs, and these were men in need. That night, under the shroud of a moonless sky, Danilo and Miloshi joined a small band of villagers, moving like ghosts through the familiar landscape. They followed the faint whispers, the rustling leaves, the unspoken intuition that guided them. And then they found him. He was sprawled beneath a giant oak, a young man barely older than Danilo, his face streaked with grime and fear, his uniform torn. His eyes, the color of a summer sky, darted wildly, reflecting a desperate confusion. He mumbled words Danilo couldn't understand, a strange, guttural tongue. But the raw terror in his gaze was universal. Milos, without a word, knelt beside him. He offered a flask of rakija, the potent plum brandy that warmed the soul and blurred the edges of pain. The American, hesitant at first, took a tentative sip, then another, the warmth spreading through him. Danilo watched, a silent witness to this unspoken pact. They were enemies of the enemy. That was enough. Over the next few days, word spread through the hidden valleys and isolated hamlets. More had fallen. Americans. Hundreds of them, it was whispered, scattered like seeds across the autumn earth, and with each whisper, the network of Serbian compassion, already strained by years of war, stretched further. Farmers, their fields already neglected, became protectors. Women, their larders meager, shared their last scraps. Children, their games interrupted, became watchful sentinels. At their small, humble home, the American Airman, Lieutenant James "Jimmy" Stewart, slowly began to heal. Anka, with the gentle touch of a mother, nursed his scrapes and bruises, her homemade poultices easing the pain. Danilo, despite the language barrier, found himself drawn to the young pilot. Jimmy, with his earnest eyes and quiet gratitude, reminded him of an older brother he'd never had. He learned to say, "H, vala," thank you, in Serbian, and the way he pronounced it, with a soft, almost shy lilt, always brought a small, sad smile to Anka's lips. Jimmy, in turn, tried to teach Danilo a few English words: plane, home, friend. They communicated with gestures, with smiles, with the shared understanding that transcended words. Danilo learned of a faraway land, of vast cities, of freedoms he could barely imagine. Jimmy learned of a life rooted in the land, a culture steeped in tradition, and a courage born of relentless adversity. The Chetniks, the royalist resistance fighters under General Mihailovic, became the orchestrators of this silent, sprawling rescue effort. They were a complicated force, a maze of alliances and rivalries, but in this, they were clear. These Americans were guests, and their safety was paramount. Major George Musselin and Lieutenant Nick Lalich, Serbian Americans from the OSS, had arrived, weaving their way through the treacherous landscape, their presence a beacon of hope. They spoke the language, understood the nuances, and began to organize the scattered fragments of downed airmen into a cohesive whole. "We need an airstrip," Major Musselin had said, his voice raspy with fatigue, but his eyes alight with fierce determination. "A place large enough for a C-47. And it must be hidden. Completely hidden." The whisper turned into a roar, a collective resolve that swept through the villages. Pranjani. A long, flat meadow, usually used for grazing livestock, stretched between two forested hills. It was perfect. And it was here that Danilo, his father, and every able-bodied man, woman, and even child in the surrounding area converged. The building of the airstrip was an act of profound, unwavering faith. There were no machines, no sophisticated tools. Only hands. Calloused, strong, determined hands. They worked under the cloak of night, illuminated by the pale glow of the moon, or by the flickering light of lanterns held close to the ground. Danilo remembered the ache in his shoulders, the blisters on his palms, the constant gnawing fear of discovery. He and his father spent countless hours prying loose stubborn rocks, their muscles screaming in protest. The women, their headscarves pulled tight against the night chill, carried armfuls of dirt in makeshift baskets, their footsteps silent and methodical. Children, too young to wield shovels, would clear away pebbles, their small fingers working with a seriousness that belied their years. They were building not just a runway, but a bridge to freedom, a testament to their unwavering humanity. One night, exhausted but exhilarated, Danilo paused, leaning on his shovel. He looked up at the vast expanse of the night sky, a canvas of 1,000 stars. He imagined Jimmy peering down from those distant American plains, wondering if he would ever see home again. And in that moment, Danilo felt a profound connection, a shared destiny with these strangers from another world. They were fighting for something bigger than themselves, a nebulous concept of freedom that resonated deep within his own oppressed heart. The days blurred into weeks. The meadow, once a patchwork of wild grass and hidden stones, began to transform. It was still rough, still imperfect, but it was there. A runway born of sweat and sacrifice. Then came the message. A crackle on the hidden radio, a coded series of numbers that only Major Musselin understood. "They're coming," he announced, his voice tight with anticipation. "Tonight, 6 planes." A wave of nervous energy, crackling like static, swept through the small community. This was it. The moment they had all been waiting for, praying for. The risk was immense. German patrols were always close. One wrong move, one misplaced sound, and everything would be lost. Not just the airmen's lives, but their own. Danilo stood beside his father at the edge of the newly made runway, his heart thrumming like a trapped bird. The air was thick with tension and the smell of pine. He could just make out the figures of the other villagers, standing in silent vigil, their faces pale in the faint moonlight. More than 500 airmen, bundled together, their faces a mixture of desperation and fragile hope, waited in the darkness. Jimmy was among them, a ghostly silhouette in the gloom. Suddenly, a distant drone. A low hum that grew steadily, swelling into a powerful roar. 6 enormous shapes, darker than the night itself, emerged from the sky. C-47 transport planes, their engines a thunderous symphony of liberation. They were piloted by the brave Buffalo soldiers, whose skin was the color of rich earth and whose courage was unwavering. The first plane touched down, its wheels kicking up dust, a triumphant rumble echoing through the valley. A collective gasp, then a wave of exhilaration. The door opened, and the airmen, a surge of pent-up energy, began to move. Danilo watched as Jimmy, his face illuminated by the plane's interior light, turned and saw him. A flash of recognition, a brief, heartfelt nod. It was a silent goodbye, a promise of remembrance. The scene was a beautiful, terrifying chaos. The airmen, many injured, some barely able to walk, were helped onto the planes by the Chetniks, by the villagers, by anyone who could lend a hand. The planes loaded and took off, one after another, their powerful engines shaking the very ground beneath their feet. Danilo felt tears prick at his eyes. These men, once strangers, had become a part of their lives. They had shared their bread, their fears, their hopes, and now they were gone, carried away on the wings of freedom. The last plane ascended into the night, its red taillights slowly fading into the starlit expanse. A profound silence descended upon the valley, broken only by the wind sighing through the plum trees. It was over. Operation Halyard, the largest rescue of downed airmen in history, was complete. The next morning, life in Pranjani returned to its ancient rhythm, but it was a rhythm subtly altered. The presence of the war remained, a looming shadow, but there was also a quiet pride, a shared secret that bound them together. They had done something extraordinary, something truly human, in a world consumed by inhumanity. But the world, as Danilo would soon learn, was a fickle and forgetful place. The rescued airmen returned home, celebrated as heroes, their stories of escape filling newspaper headlines. But the story of their Serbian saviors, of the villages that had risked everything, began to fade. Yugoslavia, once a nation battling a common enemy, was torn asunder by internal strife. Tito's communist partisans, ascendant and ruthless, began to rewrite history. Mihailovich, once an allied darling, was demonized, condemned as a collaborator, his contributions erased. And with him, the brave villagers of Pranjani, their selfless acts of courage, vanished into the shadows of post-war politics. Danilo watched as the narrative shifted, distorted, heard the whispers that dismissed the Chetniks and, by extension, the very people who had risked their lives. It was as if their sacrifice meant nothing, as if the kindness they had shown, the lives they had saved, had never happened. His father, Milos, never spoke of it again. He simply returned to his fields, his back bent, his hands still strong. Anka, too, maintained her quiet dignity, but Danilo could see the sadness in her eyes, the silent acknowledgement of a truth denied. Years passed. The war ended, but new wars, cold and insidious, began. Danilo grew into a man, his hair flecked with gray. He married, had children, and taught them the lessons his own parents had imparted: resilience, patience, compassion. But the memory of Operation Halyard, of Jimmy Stewart and the other American flyers, remained a vivid ember in his heart. He heard snippets, sometimes, of attempts to bring the truth to light. Of American veterans who spoke of their gratitude, of the efforts by individuals to acknowledge Mihailovich's role. But the official narrative, the one embraced by the communist regime, was a relentless tide, sweeping away inconvenient truths. It wasn't until much later, decades later, after the fall of the Iron Curtain, after the fracturing of Yugoslavia, that the whispers began to grow louder again. Historians, armed with declassified documents and unwavering determination, began to piece together the fragmented story. Descendants of the rescued airmen, propelled by their parents' fading memories, sought out the truth. News reached Pranjani. A delegation of Americans was coming. They wanted to see the old airstrip. They wanted to meet the villagers. They wanted to say, "H. Vala." Danilo, now an old man, his steps slower, his vision dimmer, felt a tremor of emotion he hadn't experienced in years. The long-buried memories surfaced, vivid and raw. He remembered the feel of the earth under his calloused hands, the ache in his muscles, the triumphant roar of the C-47s taking flight. He remembered Jimmy's eyes, full of terror, then gratitude. He stood by the monument that had been erected, a simple, powerful stone, etching the names of the brave. He saw the faces of the American visitors, their eyes wide with respect, their voices thick with emotion. They spoke of unsung heroes, of a forgotten chapter, of a debt unpaid. And then, a young man, a grandson of one of the rescued airmen, approached him. He looked so much like the young Jimmy of Danilo's memory, with the same earnest eyes and quiet intensity. He held out his hand. "My grandfather told me about you," the young man said, his voice soft, almost reverent. "He said you saved his life. He said you were the kindest people he ever met." Danilo, his throat tight with emotion, simply nodded. He couldn't speak. The words were trapped, caught in the surge of a lifetime of unspoken truths. But his eyes, old and wise, conveyed everything. The gratitude, the sacrifice, the enduring power of human connection. The wind still sighed through the plum trees of Pranjani. But now, it carried a different tune, a song of remembrance, a symphony of reconciliation. The story of Operation Halyard, of the Serbian farmers who saved downed American airmen, was finally emerging from the shadows, a testament to the fact that even in the darkest of times, the light of human kindness can never be truly extinguished. And Danilo, a simple farmer, knew in his heart that this was a legacy stronger than any political narrative, more enduring than any war. It was the enduring truth of humanity. He looked at the young American, a ghost of the past made real in the present, and for the first time in a very long time, he felt a profound and abiding peace. The story was not just about planes and pilots, but about the enduring human spirit, the quiet courage of ordinary people, and the profound connection that can be forged between strangers in the crucible of war. It was a story etched not in history books, but in the heart of a Serbian valley, in the calloused hands of its people, and in the thankful eyes of those who had found salvation in a land far from home. A novel of courage, sacrifice, and the unbreakable bonds of humanity.